my God. Sorry, I've literally done this so many times and that's never happened. How embarrassing. Okay, well, we got it out of the way. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us for our event for the Intersectional Environmentalist with Leah Thomas and Kiana Kazemi. Let's make some noise for them. Yeah, and make some noise for yourselves for showing up, and also online people. You can do, like, that's a request, like make some, this is exciting. Yeah. So I'm Cara, I'm the events coordinator here for Green Apple Books. Thank you so much for joining us both in person and online. I have a little bit of business to attend to before we jump into the really fun part of the evening. I want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events that we do have. I'm also going to demask in order to do so. This coming Tuesday, April 5th at 7 p.m., Amina Ahmad is going to be joining us for the launch of her novel, The Return of Faraz Ali. Ahmad will be in conversation with Ruchika Tomar. This book is like wild and beautiful and feels like a movie, and that is on April 5th at 7 p.m., right where we are right now, or online. We do have a full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We have a pretty good calendar, but I'm a little biased, but I would encourage you to check it out. And I would be remiss if I did not say, please do buy books if you are able. Please do buy books from us if you are able. I can think of at least one book that you might want to buy this evening if you haven't already. But in all seriousness, I know it's like tough and we can't always buy books, but if you want to, I would encourage you to do so. And I would encourage you to do it from an independent bookstore like this one. When you buy, thank you so much. When you buy books from us, you help us put on events like these and keep the lights on and keep our unionized staff like working. And you also support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book. So that part is pretty cool. Consider it if you have not already. Thank you so much. We're going to have a discussion between Leah and Kiana tonight, and then we are going to follow it up with a Q&A and then a signing line. So that is how things are going to go this evening. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the folks that are joining us this evening. First, Kiana Kazemi is an environmental justice advocate and intersectional engineer, passionate about democratizing access to environmental education and climate anxiety mental health care. Outside of writing and organizing, she loves to build community spaces that embody the joyful future she hopes to see. Kiana is the director of programming at Intersectional Environmentalists and also co-founded Circularity, a multimedia platform and soon-to-be app that bridges the gaps between climate action and mental health. Please do welcome Kiana Kazemi. And last but most certainly not least, Leah Thomas is an intersectional environmental activist and eco-communicator based in Southern California. Welcome to Northern California. She's passionate about advocating for and exploring the relationship between social justice and environmentalism, and was the first to define the term intersectional environmentalism. She's the founder of at Green Girl Leah and the Intersectional Environmentalist platform. Her articles on this topic have appeared in Vogue, Elle, and many other places. She's also been featured in Harper's Bazaar, W Magazine, and Domino, as well as numerous podcasts. She has a BS in Environmental Science and Policy from Chapman University and worked for the beloved National Park Service and Patagonia headquarters before pursuing activism full-time. Her book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet, is the reason we are all here tonight. So please do join me in welcoming Leah Thomas.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna move this. Maybe we can put them here. Yeah, I'll put it. How's everyone doing tonight? Okay, I like it. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. This is one of my first times in the Bay Area. I've kind of popped in and out, but I love it so much, and people keep telling me that I should live here, so we'll figure it out. I think I might. You should. But yeah, I'm super stoked to be here today to talk all about this book that I wrote, The Intersectional Environmentalist, alongside one of my friends, Kiana. And I'll do a really short reading, but I really just want to talk to you all about why I wrote this book and why we created this organization together. And today I actually got the news that my book is a March indie bestseller on bookshop.org. So please support your local indies. That means so much to me. And if you can, pick up a copy of the book from here. Yeah, that grassroots momentum that people are supporting their local indies makes me so happy. But yeah, so for those of you all who don't know me, I go by Green Girl Leah on the internets. That's because my blog is called Green Girl Leah, and I started it because I really just wanted to document being Black and joyful in nature. And over time, I found this beautiful digital community of other Black awesome people doing things in nature. And then I realized the power of creating these digital ecosystems to find like-minded people. And that meant a lot to me because in my environmental studies, working as a park ranger, or even at Patagonia, there weren't really a lot of people who looked like me. And for a second, I let it fool me to think that maybe my community wasn't out there, but they were out there, and they've been out there for a very long time. And I was able to find them, but at times it was really difficult. And I think that's why I wanted to create Intersectional Environmentalists as a platform, so it wasn't so difficult anymore. So if someone wanted to know the history of the environmental justice movement, they could find it. If someone wanted to find Black, Indigenous, and people of color that have been a part of environmental history, it wouldn't be so hard to find. And I think that's the future of environmental education, one that's intersectional and inclusive of all the world's people and their stories.
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess to get into it, so Kiana, how did we meet and how did you get involved with Intersectional Environmentalists to kind of kick us off?
Yeah, I don't know if this mic works, but I can also project. Okay, that's okay. I can speak pretty loudly. Yeah, so I think the way that we got connected was during the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement. I was speaking a lot about the lack of acknowledgement of the movement and also just environmental justice in a lot of my communities. I'm an engineer studying computer science at Berkeley. And it's safe to say that the engineering movement as a whole is very male dominated and very white dominated. And even within, people of color, like groups in the engineering realm, you don't hear a ton about environmental and social justice issues. And I think that is as a result of a lot of things. I think a lot of first generation immigrant people of color feel this like burden to provide for their families, and as a result don't have the capacity to also be activists in that space. But I think it's still really important that we incorporate social and environmental justice education into our educational systems and institutions, and make sure that we're talking about them and the results of engineering institutions in the world, because everything that we touch is built by an engineer. Our buildings, our roads, our technologies that we use are all built by engineers. And so I was really talking about this within very small communities that I was in and on social media. And then I got connected with Deandra, who is a co-founder of IE. We hopped on a chat and we were, just like going off talking about all of these issues that we really cared about. And I think it just made so much sense that, we began to work together. I think almost like at the same time that you all were creating IE. And so very shortly after, I joined the team and have been there for a while since.
And it's been awesome ever since. But yeah, so why is it so important to include Black, Indigenous, and people of color within environmental movements and spaces and education? It's not just because, we're awesome and have amazing stories to share. But unfortunately, when we're not included, then we start to see laws that don't equally include us. And it's Earth Day today. And as a part of my research for this book, I was looking at the civil rights movement and how shortly after we see this Earth Day movement. And because of the Earth Day movement, it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. They call it alphabet soup because it was just like CAA, CWA, CA, so many letters. But all of this substantial environmental policy that we see today. And then you might start to wonder, why did we need to have an environmental justice movement that isn't always taught in modern environmental education in the 80s? Because shouldn't the Earth Day movement have, combined some of that civil rights momentum? But, they didn't. And they left out a lot of people of color, which meant we had to have a separate movement that didn't get nearly enough support. And we saw that toxic waste was being diverted into low income and Black and Brown communities. We are seeing these startling statistics that African Americans in the United States, about 71% live in counties that are in violation of federal air quality standards. And people of color are living with a pollution burden, which means they're exposed to up to 2.5 times more pollution than they cause. And when I was in, the dark research lab in college, this data was so accessible and it was so easy for me to find. And that made it even scarier that it's well known at the Environmental Protection Agency that people of color and low-income communities are bearing the brunt of climate injustice. And yet the environmental community, the mainstream environmental community, wasn't as outraged. And that was so startling to me. So like what Kiana was saying, during the summer of 2020, there were a lot of environmentalists that were wondering, when are environmentalists going to stand up for Black and Brown and Indigenous lives? And environmentalism in a lot of ways felt incomplete if we weren't able to advocate for the protection of people alongside the advocacy of the planet. And I think one of the reasons why I created IE was because I could no longer participate in a type of environmentalism that would allow these oversights to occur. And then I also wrote a book at the same time, and I'd love to read you just 2 paragraphs from the introduction that kind of sum it up. And then we'll get into a little bit more of our Q&A. Yeah. Are there any environmental science students in the crowd? Hey. That's awesome. And not to put you on the spot, but is environmental justice mandatory in your degree? No. So that's one of the things that we're fighting with our organization. We believe that it needs to be mandatory for people to learn about the environmental justice movement, for them to learn about people like Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, and Hazel M. Johnson, the mother of environmental justice. We think students should be able to recall their names as easily as they can recall John Muir's name, because with that knowledge, I just can't wait to see the climate solutions of the future. But the thesis of this book, I would say, is that we can't save the planet without uplifting the voices of its people, especially those most often unheard, and that we should care about the protection of people as much as we care about the protection of our planet, because to me, those fights are the same. And as a society, we often forget that humans are a part of our global ecosystem and that we don't exist separately from nature, we coexist with it each and every day. Unfortunately, as with other animals, some humans are endangered and facing a multitude of social and environmental injustices that impact their ability to not only survive, but also thrive in liberation and joy. Why then are conservation efforts not extended to the protection of endangered humans and their human rights? This is a question that I've struggled with as a Black environmentalist for years, because in my environmental practice, caring for the earth means caring for its people. And you can't separate those two things. So, Kiana, in your opinion, why can you not separate the advocacy of people from the advocacy for the planet?
Yeah, I think that's a question that we are constantly thinking about at IE, and it's just an embodiment of the work that we do. But oh, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm an Iranian immigrant, and I immigrated to the US when I was 16. And a big part of that identity has been to understand what my relationship with my environmental advocacy is, and what my relationship with my Iranian identity is, and how those interact with each other, and how the very different parts of me interact with my environmentalism. And I think that's a big part of the constant struggle that I think marginalized communities and marginalized people are struggling with in the mainstream environmental movement. Whether you are an immigrant, whether you are Black or brown, you're queer, you're trans, you're disabled, there are so many parts of us as human beings that interact with our relationship to the environment. And constantly within the environmental movement, the narrative is that, the planet is dying, which maybe it is true, but who are the people at the forefront of those struggles? Who are the people facing those environmental injustices and hazards right now? And why aren't they the ones who are talking about those issues and given the voice and given the platform to talk about those issues? And so often the mainstream environmental movement takes this narrative of like the numbers and the statistics and the data, which is all really important and is a part of the work that, as a data scientist, I do. But it's also important to talk about all of that data through the narrative and through the framework of environmental justice. And so that's why I think it's so important that we're incorporating that into all of the educational spaces that we exist in, not just as an environmental science student should you learn about environmental justice, but as an engineering student, you should learn about environmental justice. As a doctor, you should learn about environmental justice. As an English major, you should learn about environmental justice, because our relationship to the planet is something that we each hold and is an ancestral thing that we all have, is a process that as we all grow up, we build, and our relationships with one another are also part of that. And so I think that's why it's important that within our environmentalism, we also incorporate the advocacy for people and the people at the forefront of those movements.
Absolutely. So something that I often heard, because I feel like when you say it out loud, it sounds almost obvious, like we should care about people and the planet. But unfortunately, that hasn't really truly been reflected enough in modern environmental education and policy decisions, because if it were, we wouldn't see environmental hazards and negative outcomes so closely linked to identity. And it's not just one or two, it's almost all of the environmental injustices. When you look at the data, things like the placement of trees and tree cover is directly correlated and linked to income and race. And that's leading to a lot of really startling health outcomes, like lack of tree cover, in addition to not helping the air quality, is also leading to an increase of heat-related illnesses. In some of my research, I also found that Native Hawaiians are the most exposed to Superfund sites in all of the so-called United States, and that's so scary. They're closely located to toxic waste sites and facilities, etc. And this data is really, really startling. And I think in a lot of environmental spaces I've been in, when people would say, okay, racial justice is not as urgent as the climate crisis. And when I heard those sorts of sentiments, it really started to hurt my heart, but I couldn't understand why until I started talking about intersectional environmentalism. And it was because that focus on the future was for them. That focus on the future was them saying to me as a Black environmentalist, in the future, this is when it will impact me and my white grandchildren and maybe my white kids. But right now, I'm going to ignore how environmental injustice is impacting you and your community and all the marginalized communities right now. And it's impacting our ability to not only just like live and thrive, but just experience joy and develop a safe relationship with Mother Earth. So that's why it's so urgent. I'll get up off my soapbox for a second, but I guess I am on a stool, so I get to talk a bit. Okay, so into some of the fun stuff. So for those of you all, is anyone following Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram? If you're not, please follow us. I'll also throw on my personal blog, or Leah. But the story behind it just makes me smile so much. I was furloughed from my position at Patagonia at the time. They did ask me to come back. But I was furloughed during the summer of 2020. And this is when there's this huge racial awakening in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, the start of the pandemic, so many things were happening. And I truly felt like I had nothing to lose. And I was really frustrated with my environmental peers. And I had gone to a protest about endangered salmon right before the pandemic started. I was taking it to the streets for the salmon. And yet the same people I was next to were silent when it came to the Black Lives Matter movement and the advocacy of my people. And when I would ask questions, or they would share things on Instagram that would read like, "You don't have to speak up about every injustice." I'm like, okay, so you don't want to speak up about Black lives, interesting. But they were silent, and it hurt my heart because I took it to the streets for endangered salmon. I took it to the streets for polluted waterways, and I didn't understand why my so-called friends or peers or coworkers in the environmental space wouldn't stand up for me. And I felt like I had nothing to lose, so I just took it to the digital realm, and I said I want to practice a type of environmentalism called intersectional environmentalism, like intersectional feminism. That's so deeply within that environmental practice is the advocacy for marginalized people and uplifting their voices. And I'm just going to post about it online. I'm going to create a pledge for anyone who wants to join me. And in rainbow lettering, I wrote over and over again, environmentalist for Black Lives Matter, because I needed to say that, but I also wanted it to be joyful. So that's why I infused it with so many colors. And I walked away after I posted it on Instagram, and I came back to my phone, and my life changed forever. I had thousands and thousands of people messaging me and following me on Instagram saying, "What is intersectional environmentalism?" I had WF in my DMs and the Sierra Club saying, "How can we make a statement? What do we do?" And I realized there were so many people in the environmental space that wanted to speak up for racial justice, but they just didn't know how. And they never needed my permission, but in some ways, I feel like defining that as intersectional environmentalism helped a lot of companies and organizations see that, yes, as environmentalists, the protection of humans is so important to our work. So then, like when Kiana was talking about earlier, when we met each other, it was because, I mean, when else in history would thousands of people suddenly be begging you for environmental justice research? This was so cool. So we just started to organize a group of environmentalists to meet that demand and post about it on social media so people could learn more about intersectional environmentalism and learn more about the organizations that were already doing this work so we could point them in the right direction to start their journey. So looking back at that time, Kiana, is there anything that kind of like stood out to you or a learning lesson? Because sometimes when you're in that grassroots momentum, like you're just doing it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know why you're doing it. We didn't know that this organization would become a nonprofit, would become a community of over 400,000 people in just 2 years. We had no idea, but we were just, doing the thing. But yeah, were there any takeaways or things that you learned during that time?
Yeah, I think my favorite post that I don't write a ton of posts for IE. I do all of our programming, so events like this, but at the initial stage, I think it was like 5 or 6 of us doing everything. We were like barely sleeping. It was a lot. We were still kind of tired. But so I was like, okay, like maybe I'll try writing a little post. And so I wrote a post that was titled, "The Planet Can't Afford Another 4 Years of Donald Trump." And this post like blew up. It went really viral and we had so many people engaging with it. And it was just a really funny moment of like realizing that sometimes it's like little funny things like that that just like mean a lot to people and people really want to engage with. And so I think as a result, we have these like fun little stickers that say the radical left agenda or like sustainable baddies. And I think it's just become a really core part to the work that we do, is like just like making things really happy and really joyful and bringing a lens to this work that I think a lot of other people are almost scared to do, because climate change is really scary and the environmental injustices that people are experiencing are really scary and really overwhelming. And that's like, we're both little anxious beings and we experience that a lot. But what makes all of that more bearable and what makes us feel like we have power and we can use that is when we come together as communities and we like take up space in a really joyful and beautiful way. And so I think that was like one of the big learning lessons of like, sometimes we can just like make little silly things and they can have a really large impact and start really big conversations. And it's okay to like start a conversation in that way. We don't always have to, you know, go in with the data or go in with like a really gloomy educational moment. Sometimes it's really about connecting with people with really simple and accessible words and actions that they can connect with. And that's, I think, a big part of the work that we're starting to do now is like storytelling and narratives, because I think storytelling is the key to climate action. And it's really telling the stories of these frontline communities and also connecting people to those stories that's going to move people to take action. It's going to move people to hold the institutions and the systems and the corporations accountable for the work that they're doing. So narratives, comedy, joy, art, I think those are all really integral to not just intersectional environmentalism, but just like any movement, any revolutionary movement, I think should be rooted in those things. And we're so grateful for people like the NAP Ministry and Adrienne Marie Brown for really like passing those things down to us and teaching us those things that we embody in all of our work.
And just to plug something else about Joy, so this was another one of my favorite projects. So a lot of what we were doing, we were compiling resources on social media because it was accessible. And even though Kiana and I, like, we both have a background in science and environmental science and things like that, I remember going back home to St. Louis, Missouri after my first year as an environmental science student and just rambling off to my family and then looking at me like, okay, cool, all right, alrighty. And I didn't like that because I felt like I was acting super elitist. I think the early environmental movement that I joined when I was in college was really based in shame. There's people shaming everybody about plastic straws and why you need to be buying $200 t-shirts and only buying 2 t-shirts a year and living out of a mason jar. It was just really inaccessible.
Wild times.
Wild times. Things have changed a little bit. Yeah. But early on, I started realizing the power of communications and meeting people exactly where they're at. So I started shifting things up a little bit. I started studying religious studies as a minor. And then I also started speaking, I'm not religious, but I started speaking at churches about climate. And I learned a lot because there were sometimes somewhat conservative churches, but they came to me and they said, you know, we view the earth as one of God's creations. Therefore, we will care about this climate thing if you tell us about it. So I didn't come into those spaces and say intersectional environmentalism, dismantling systems of oppression, like, you know, the words that I love so much. But I said, if this is your pathway to caring for the planet, here's how you can do it. And just being really open to meeting people exactly where they're at. And that's what we did on social media. We didn't want this academic information to be gatekept in academic institutions. And what's the use of all this climate science if only like 2 people with PhDs can understand it? Or even if it's thousands of environmental science students can understand it, we need better communicators to be able to communicate this to the everyday person. So that's why we experiment with play, we experiment with words, we experiment with colors, because we want this to be as accessible as possible. So this is also another project. We just got it printed. We are so stoked. But this is our zine, and a lot of this has some of our social media posts and some of our art and things like that in this sort of format. So when students or anyone wants to enter the world of climate justice, it can also feel fun at the same time, and it doesn't have to be rooted in that doom and gloom. And I think the work that we do at Intersectional Environmentalists, it's twofold. So one is, yes, talking about who is being impacted the most by the climate crisis and the vulnerable communities that are being impacted. But the other part is the joy in uncovering those beautiful stories of Black and Brown, Indigenous, and queer people who are a part of the environmental movement. They're a part of environmental history, uncovering their stories. So a young Black girl from the Midwest like me can grow up and see herself reflected in environmental education and care so deeply for this earth. So that's why we experiment with colors and play. And please also check out the IE agenda. It will be on sale again eventually. But in the meantime, please do check out my book. And speaking of design, just a little tidbit that I said earlier at Berkeley, but I absolutely, again, a nod to art would be this font. If you go to the back of the book, if you have it, this typeface was actually created by someone, a gentleman named Trey Seals, who is a Black graphic designer and artist that founded an organization called Vocal Type. And this typeface is inspired by the signage of the Memphis sanitation strike of 1968. At which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech and participated in a protest with people who were protesting the environmental conditions of the sanitation plant. So words and fonts have meaning, and that was kind of one of the first protests that combined environmental injustice with worker rights and social justice. And looking at the signs and how powerful that is, that's why I wanted to use a typeface like this. And yeah, just another nod to art and design. So check it out. But yeah, okay, I'm gonna ask you some rapid fire questions, Kiana, that I'm pulling out of the top of my brain. And then we'll go into a Q&A with all of you all. And I'll just go bam, bam.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So what is one of your favorite stories or things that you learned in your last year of working with IE, or almost 2 years?
2 years now, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so we did a really beautiful project at the Berkeley Student Farms, which is a farm run by students working at the intersection of food justice and environmental justice. And we took these really beautiful portraits. Should I hold? Okay. It's not that fast. We took these really beautiful portraits of all of these farmers and student gardeners who put so much love and so much work into curating this beautiful garden and this beautiful farm. And just shared their stories. We interviewed them. We took these beautiful portraits of them, and then we just shared those stories online. And that, I think, might be one of my favorite things, alongside this zine, might be one of my favorite things that we've done at IE.
And what's a story that you wish more people talked about in the climate justice movement?
Might need a second to think about this one. Yeah, I think something that I was actually talking about this earlier today with some friends. I think a story that I really love, really niche stories. So like I said, I'm Iranian, and a lot of times I find myself occupying spaces that are relatively simple or similar to the spaces that to my identities. IE really brings all of my identities together. But sometimes I'm okay, but what about the Iranian activists? What about the Iranian designers and artists and writers who are doing this work as well, but we never get to have our own space. And so I just want to have like smaller niches of spaces where people with really specific identities can come together and just like bond and connect and feel like they have autonomy over a space of their own. And so, I don't know if that kind of answers.
Great answer. So Kiana, fun fact, is actually also a published writer because she is featured in this book. So shout out to you. And yeah, there's also about 30 contributors in this book. And I think that was such an important learning lesson about the power of community. I wouldn't have been able to write this book or found this organization without other people. You can't do it all alone. You shouldn't do it all alone. Everything is enhanced with community, so I'm super stoked. But your question that is in this book is also about student activism. So for students who want to get involved in the fight for climate justice, like, yeah, what are some tips that you have for them?
Yeah, and before I answer that, I actually want to say that sometimes like being published is really difficult. Not sometimes, like just in the world that we live in, that's like a really big deal. And it's like something that's really hard for people to have access to. So not only am I like so honored to be in this book, but that was something that we also wanted to do in this zine and in our future generations of the zine, is like making space for everyday people to be published because it's really difficult. And so when we have this platform, we want to make sure that we include as many voices in it as possible and kind of start to demystify like what it means to be an author, what it means to be a writer or a storyteller, because everyone, like that's something that we all do on a daily basis. And so we all kind of deserve to take up this space. And so I'm really grateful for like just this book and also like the spaces we get to create for other people. But I think in the realm of student activism, some of my friends are here who are also student organizers and inspire me so much. Sometimes it can be really exhausting to be a student activist and organizer. You're doing your schoolwork on top of working a job to like pay for your basic needs. Then you're trying to go into these predominantly white spaces and speak up for your people and your experiences. And it's a constant battle and it's a constant fight. And it's really exhausting because you're constantly being gaslit by the institutions. You're being told that, you know, you're just being like a silly Gen Zer and none of these things matter. And a lot of times these institutions know how to quiet you down. Sometimes they'll just like stall and they'll just like wait you out because the institution is like so fast going that we're only there for 4 years. And so if a big movement happens on campus, they kind of just wait. They just wait and they wait and they wait and they'll do little things here and there. And 4 years later, you're gone and none of that knowledge is there anymore. And so another set of students is now going to have to restart that. And as a result, none of that work ever actually gets done in the institution because they're so good at, you know, stalling these processes. So something that we've learned is the passage of knowledge and institutionalizing that passing on of knowledge. And a lot of my friends like Sarah here and Jed, who are my mentors at Berkeley, just taught me the importance of passing on that knowledge and creating spaces where intergenerationally you're able to communicate and talk about your experiences and make sure that the things that have been learned and the wrongs that have been done to you and your people don't get forgotten. So I think that's like the best place to start, is to not restart the wheel, but tap into the movements that already exist and find the people who are already doing the work, because likely they are there and you just need to find them and you'll find your place and you'll know where to fit in. And I think that goes for any institution. It's not just colleges, it's like workplaces, it's governments, it's like any space that's really institutionalized and really bureaucratic. There are always people on the margins doing the work. So just finding them and supporting them, I think is really important.
yes to that. And as a last question, so we, as we founded Intersectional Environmentalists, stumbled across the NAP ministries. Is anyone familiar with their work? Ooh, I got a couple of snaps. So to take it all the way back, so the Black Panther Party really kind of created this framework around radical self-care. So self-care as a concept has been kind of commercialized in recent years, but it actually has some really radical roots and origins, because there were people like the Black Panther Party that were doing this radical and revolutionary work. And then they realized we really need to take care of ourselves and also take care of our community. We need to rest so we can show up. And then you start to see some of these programs that the Black Panthers had to take care of children in the community, make sure everybody was fed, make sure people could meditate, making sure people were okay. So the roots of self-care are very, very revolutionary. Fast forward to an organization that is called the NAP Ministries that builds off of that framework. Their motto is that rest is a radical act of resistance in the world that we live in. Because there are so many systems of oppression at play, how radical is it for someone to say, actually, today, I will reclaim rest, I will find joy, I will nap, because I'm a part of this beautiful global community of activists that are fighting. And it's okay if I tap out for a second, because I know that my community will hold me and I can tap back in to make sure people in my community can rest. So that's kind of a framework that we've tried to adopt. And then we've also added joy into the mix and play and playing with colors, etc. So a part of my environmental activism and a part of the way that I resist oppressive systems is by finding joy, always smiling, not always smiling when I'm sad, but smiling as much as I can, because that's something that nobody can take away from me. And that's something that my ancestors have taught me, because throughout history as African Americans, we still found joy. So that's how I'm going to show up, and that's how I'm going to practice my activism. And I hope that you all also reclaim rest and joy. And to end it, Kiana, how are some of the ways that you find rest and joy as a radical act of resistance?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really beautiful part of just like what we do and what we preach. And sometimes it's really difficult to actually like live that. And it feels a little hypocritical sometimes, because like we're talking about all of these things and talking about mental health and rest, but then because of the positions that we're in, we don't actually take the time to practice those things. So I think the constant reminder is helpful, but sometimes it can also become like, oh, I'm just going to talk about this thing, but I won't necessarily like practice it. And so I think like recentering that in a way that's like, okay, how am I actually doing that like this weekend is really important. And I think for me, it's sometimes in the little ways. Sometimes it's like in the effort that I put in like the clothes that I wear and the brightness of like the colors I'm wearing and how I match them together, and my like blue eyeliner or like a purple bag that I have, or the food that I take time to make. You know, I think going back to that ancestry, like the foods that my mom always made for me or my grandma always made for me, just brings such a feeling of nostalgia that make me feel really comforted. And I don't get to see my family very often because they live really far away. And so sometimes it's like doing those things or putting on my red lipstick that reminds me of my mom that make me the happiest. And throughout the day, as I'm like really overwhelmed and overworked and just like doing too much, I just like looking at myself and like seeing that stain of the red lipstick just like brings me a sense of peace and a sense of home that I might not otherwise have. So sometimes it's in the little things, and it's also nice to like, you know, go outside and be with friends and have a picnic. But when those things aren't possible, I think incorporating moments of joy and familiarity into your day are really important.
It's the little things. And also that would be such a brilliant essay. I don't know if you've already written one, but about like
My mom's
in your
lipstick.
mom. Oh my God, I can't wait to read it. But with that, if anyone has any questions before we get into the signing, feel free to ask. Ooh, judge.
I have a quick question. My name is Leo. I'm a master's student at UC Berkeley, so go Bears.
Go Bears.
I guess my question is, if I word it correctly, in short, how important is accessible language in regards to like communication? Like how important is that in the environmental aspect? In regards to like when, as a environmental like researcher and stuff, when you're presenting, using words and statements like historically excluded, individuals versus minorities or like stuff like that. I don't know how important is like that language and expressing that language to others.
So I love communications. I wanted to be a comms major, but my mom is very traditional and said, you will be a doctor or you will do science communicator for that very reason, because some environmental language or even kind of social justice speak, while I might use it amongst friends, I am always willing to break it down for someone to be able to understand, because it isn't about ego, and words sometimes change very, very quickly. So even if we're talking about like POC, people of color, and then we started talking about BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, now we're starting to talk about historically excluded and not necessarily using the terminology minorities, or using, maybe not using vulnerable communities and using something that sounds more empowering. But just because that's happening within social justice spaces, that doesn't mean that that's happening everywhere. And if I sense that I'm in a space, even if it's like a church or something like that, I'm always willing to work with the words so anyone can understand. And that is not diluting my message in any way. It's helping to spread it far and wide. So sometimes that is something that I struggle with. Like if someone gets angry with someone because they say the word minority instead of saying historically excluded, or they say BIPOC because that feels really good to them, but someone doesn't like that terminology. Sometimes I think the semantics can get in the way, because the goal, again, is to activate as many people as possible for climate action. And I never want anyone to feel excluded. But I will kindly tell people, like, if I do adopt new terminology, I will try to explain it to people. Like, here's why I prefer this terminology. But if they don't use it, I mean, if it's offensive, then I'll step in and say something. But just being willing to meet people where they're at. I also really think, in addition to every environmental program having a mandatory environmental justice class, having a mandatory climate communications class, this is kind of an emerging field of study that I think is only going to grow more and more, because we need more climate communicators to spread this message far and wide and to find out that sort of terminology that works with the everyday person. So again, not diluting your message in any way, but transforming it so that it's accessible and you can meet people where they're at. But yeah, any thoughts?
Maybe just, I think also the audience is really important. I think specifically with research, sometimes it's like if you're presenting your research to an institution or presenting it to like a community that you worked with, I think there's a big difference in there. And I think the most important thing to like incorporate into that is like actually engaging with the community and understanding the language that they're most used to, and like coming to them with the language that they're familiar with in a way that's like empowering, and it's like you're actually going to present this research in a way that makes sense to you. And I think that's something that I think about a lot in like the engineering and like the research space, is like a lot of times it's like speaking at the community, it's speaking at people, and it's like very extractive. And then it's also like building for people, but not understanding like what they actually need and what they actually want. And so that community integration is really important. And sometimes I think the question that I like to ask myself is like, do I even need to be doing this research? Do I even need to be building this thing? Because sometimes the answer is no. And it's really hard in the system that we live in to say like, I'm not going to do this and like tap out of it. But sometimes I think that's a good question to ask. And, I think a lot of like scholars talk about this, like sometimes like people won't publish you if you don't have all the right language. But then it's like, who are you publishing for? Like for more like researchers who like a tiny circle of people to read, or like the actual people that need this knowledge. And I think thinking about some of those wider questions helps think about language. Yes.
So I think I love the way you said that you try to meet people where they are. And I feel like I find it difficult in bringing this conversation outside of social media to people who are not present on these platforms. So I just wanted to ask you, like, where can we start and how do we start a conversation without, I don't know, offending anyone or making them care just enough so they're going to go back and, I don't know, talk more about it?
Yeah, this is a great question. It kind of reminds me of, I spent about 3 months in super rural Kansas as a park ranger at the least visited national park in the Park Service system. So it was really rural and I didn't have much to do except for talking to farmers. There was a community of under 1,000 people where I was at. And I remember I went into it and I was just like super environmental student. And I thought I wanted to work for the EPA and I kept talking about it. And then word around town, there's only like 2 restaurants. Like someone told someone that told Bob, that told Frank that knew that I wanted to work for the EPA one day. And then all of a sudden, in a non-creepy way, these farmers were asking me to take a ride on the combine and to talk to them because they thought, hey, you one day might work for the EPA and might help make conditions better for rural farmers. And it was such a great learning experience because I went into it just so dramatic of, I hate pesticides, I hate GMOs, I hate all this stuff. And then listening to them talk about how it impacted them and saying, sometimes we'll get a letter in the mail or a call that says we have to stop using this specific pesticide and that costs us all this money and we're having a loss of culture because our kids want to run off to the city and don't want to work at the family farm anymore and we're just losing money every single year. And it was just so important for me to be able to hear from them so I could develop that nuance and then also find better ways to approach these conversations, not from a place of privilege, but to just really hear their stories. So to circle back to what you're saying, kind of taking it outside of social media, I mean, no, you don't have to be in a rural farm in Kansas, but going to spaces in a respectful way that you normally wouldn't, go to. So even if you are going to, a club or something, not like a club, but like a book club or like knitting or like whatever it is, kind of just talking to people or a club and hearing and really like hearing their stories and listening to them before you come into that space and say, this is what you need to be doing, and just being really open to listening to them and like hearing from them. But I must admit, it is kind of hard to recreate some of those instances, especially during the pandemic. And then, yeah, I guess like with family members and things like that, again, meeting them where they're at, not going into it from a place of like, I'm preaching and talking at you, but also starting from what they're already doing. Like if your family members are doing things that are sustainable that they don't even know, like, hey, it's really cool that you're reusing these plastic bags or these paper bags. And then you kind of slip in some things about sustainability. But I think starting from a place of empowerment and not judgment, it really helps those conversations go over a lot better.
I'll plug Earth Sessions real quick.
Oh, yeah.
So actually, we think about that question a lot at IE, and I'm really excited to give you a little sneak peek of a new program we have coming up called Earth Sessions, which is going to bridge the gap between environmental education and art and music. Because we too think that sometimes people love art, sometimes they love music, they love all of these different things, and all of that is so interconnected with environmentalism. So our new programming is going to be an art and environmental education experience. So our very first show in Brooklyn the day before Earth Day, is going to be a music concert that is going to be two really cool local artists there to perform. And then at the same time, we're working with two hyper-local grassroots organizations who are tackling food insecurity in Brooklyn to share about their work and why it's important to that local community. And we think that that's a really great way of like tapping people into the local things happening in their communities in a way that isn't like intrusive and isn't quite as broad, because it's like, this is happening in your own backyard. And that's a really beautiful way for people to tap into it, even if it's not necessarily under the language of like, I'm an activist or I'm X, Y, and Z. It's just like, I volunteer with this organization who's doing this really cool work in my community. And if we all did that, I think that would have such a huge impact. So yeah, keep an eye out for Earth sessions. Might have one here soon.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. So I recently entered the sustainable tech space with the million meanings of what that is. And what I'm noticing is, especially as now like climate topics are becoming more like popular, really ramping up, there's this explosion of different companies and different groups and different ideas, and some of it kind of overlaps, and then in the the typical startup way, there's like this tiny little thing that's different that like separates you on the map. And I'm looking like 2-3 years down the line and wondering, with all these different groups kind of jumping up, it's good to see more people engaged, but will we lose, organization and direction and, in all of that? And so just wondering how you guys are, or as a organization, as a group, as people, how you're thinking, do the dots always have to connect, or are we really just in a stage where it's just like go forth in whatever direction you need to make something happen?
I'm curious your thoughts on this. I would say that we are all like thinking about us being in a global ecosystem and community, and we need as many people as possible, sometimes hyper specific and focused on, there might be like very small differences, but it's all like pieces of the puzzle that we need to kind of tackle the climate crisis and also push for sustainability. So I would say one way to look at it, is that like we're all pieces of a puzzle. We can take as many people as will come along with us for this climate journey, and I think the more the merrier. But yeah, that's going to be a really interesting world that we live in, even 10 years from now, when sustainability is kind of the norm. So most companies are probably going to be sustainable. Something that scares me and I don't like to think about a lot is that oil companies like Shell, etc., they know they're on their way out, so they're monopolizing the green energy space. So the same owners of oil and gas will now be the owners of like lithium mining plants and things like that. So it's really scary, but yeah, the world's going to look really interesting in a couple of years, and there's so many things to explore. But I would say the more the merrier, but with Shell and them, they need to pay some climate reparations.
I would say I have similar sentiments, but I think I have a slightly different like framework to it. I think decentralization is really important, and like decentralization of our energy grids in like ways that are empowering to different communities and specific to the environments of those communities and the well-being of those communities. And I think that's a really cool thing that's happening like around the globe, is all of these like small organizations and companies that are all building climate solutions in their own ways. But I think something that is really important, and honestly has been a big part of our success, has been coming together as like those small niches. So like we have this like beautiful, we like to think of ourselves as a collective or a community of like different nonprofits, different companies, different people, communicators that do our separate work, but then come together every so often and support each other and uplift each other's work. And I think that's like a big part of capitalism, is that like it doesn't work like that, right? It's like this company is in competition with this company, and they might be doing like really similar work, and that's a bad thing. It's not a good thing. And so I think shifting that narrative is really important, and starting to build like unions and build coalitions of different companies or schools or whatever it is that you're in, and actually starting to have those conversations with the people who are working in the same sector and industry as you. Because I think there's so much power in numbers, and we can all do our own niche work, and that's really great, and that needs to happen. But then how do we communicate with each other? How do we build systems and structure for that communication? And most importantly, how do we support each other's work versus this like capitalistic mindset of like competing to be the best or like have the most funding. So yeah, I would recommend just like checking in with like other startups who are doing your work, because often they're struggling with the same things that you are, and they might have the answers that you are looking for. And I think that's the best way to start to build a different world for all of us, is like slowly doing that work.
Yay to coalition building. Yeah, collaboration over competition any day. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a question. Not presently, but if that is you and you know people, please hit us out. But yeah, I think we have a contributors network now at Intersectional Environmentalists. First, we were kind of a small team compiling all these resources, and then even us, we have our particular areas of study. Like with me, it's kind of communications, and then with you, it's engineering and so many other things, etc. And I think we're continuously adding to this network of people. But yeah, we're trying to do less talking at people and more talking with people and bringing in, new voices. So I think that would be a really cool area for us to explore, because it's all connected. I think we've had some research that talks about environmental hazards and how that's also kind of connected to like maternal outcomes and like health outcomes and things like that. But I haven't really gotten into it too much. But
The only person I would recommend looking into is Dominique Drakeford, who recently had a beautiful son. She's actually a sustainable fashion like advocate, and talks a lot about like her identity and the Black Lives Matter movement, and like the intersection of that with like sustainable fashion. But she just had a son, and she's been talking a lot about like that relationship and how her new like motherhood is a part of that revolutionary work. So that might be a good starting point, but definitely something we want to explore more.
absolutely. And then also ecofeminism, which I talk about in my book. And there's kind of two sects of ecofeminism. There's kind of cultural ecofeminism and radical ecofeminism, and they're just so cool, and they talk about some of these topics. So I recommend checking that out if you haven't already as well. Just a lot of like empowerment, like women empowerment, and making connections to the ways that women are treated in society and the ways that the planet is treated and the connections between those two things. It's really cool, especially radical ecofeminism. That's all about dismantling the patriarchy. So check it out. But thank you all so much for having us tonight. We will be signing books.
For Leah and Kiana. Both for joining us, and I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us as well. We do have books available for sale at the front register. You can grab them, bring them back to the back desk. I know it's a little bit of a back and forth, but we can figure this out. And we can bring them to the back desk as long as you pay for them before you leave. You can do that in whatever order, and we'll make it work. But thank you once again, and thank you to everyone online for joining us. We also have other books, so make yourself comfortable and look at those too. Thanks.
Thank you for having us. This was really lovely.
I'm so
Oh no,
sorry.
it's all good. We